The rain in the town of Blackwood did not fall so much as it possessed the air, a grey and relentless weight that turned the cobblestones into mirrors of lead. Elena Vance stood on the perimeter of the town square, her boots sinking into the churned mud, feeling the precise shape of being unseen. It was a cold draught in a room full of candles, a particular sort of isolation that came when one's social standing vanished along with the warmth of a parent's breath. At 19, she was a ghost in a morning dress of cheap sarcenet, her inheritance reduced to the 3 heavy coins pressing against her thigh. She watched the breath of the crowd bloom in white plumes, a collective shiver of anticipation for the morning's grim entertainment. The municipal auction was not merely a sale of property, it was the public dismantling of failures, a ritual the town's founding families attended with the clinical detachment of surgeons. Marcus Finch stood upon the raised timber block, his ledger protected by a cracked leather awning that dripped rhythmically onto his shoulder. As the town's opportunistic auctioneer, Finch possessed a voice like grinding gravel, a sound that lacked empathy but thrived on the cadence of liability. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp against the muffled drumming of the downpour. To his right, seated in a carriage of polished ebony that seemed to repel the very mud of the square, sat Arthur Sterling. The patriarch of the valley's wealthiest family did not look at the crowd. He looked through them, his gaze fixed on the papers held by his legal enforcer, Reginald Graves. Dr. Graves leaned close to the carriage window, his face a pale oval of bureaucratic malice, whispering terms of municipal codes that Elena could not hear, but could certainly feel in the sudden tightening of the atmosphere. The lot was called with a derisive flick of the auctioneer's wrist toward a map pinned to the backboard, a map where the northern boundary was a smudge of green and grey. Finch announced the sale of the Crag, a derelict estate that had sat in the throat of the valley for a century, growing moss and accruing debts in equal measure. The town council wanted it off the books, a legal ulcer that had swallowed every heir who dared to cleat. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, a cruel, wet sound. No one bid. The silence stretched, the exact temperature of a grave, until Elena stepped forward. Her voice was small but possessed the clarity of a bell struck in a vacuum. She offered her $3, the entirety of her world, and the square went unnaturally still. Finch stared at her, his hammer suspended. He looked to Arthur Sterling, seeking a sign of intervention, but the patriarch merely closed his eyes, a silent dismissal of a nuisance. With a sharp, mocking crack of wood on wood, the deed was settled. Elena Vance had bought a castle for the price of a winter coat, and as the townspeople began to jeer, she felt the first stirrings of a cold, iron-willed resolve. Leaving the square was like walking through a wall of frost. The whispers followed her, names like Madwoman and the Pauper Queen, but Elena kept her gaze fixed on the northern road where the trees began to thicken into an impenetrable wall of pine and oak. She did not look back at the carriage where Arthur Sterling sat, nor at the mocking grin of Reginald Graves. Instead, she felt the weight of the vellum deed in her pocket, a document that felt heavier than the stones of the town hall. Behind her, a solitary figure remained in the rain, a man with the broad shoulders of a laborer and eyes that held the quiet intensity of a mountain. Elias Thorne, the town's most reclusive stonemason, watched the girl in the black dress disappear into the mist. He did not laugh, he simply adjusted the heavy wool of his coat and looked toward the heights where the moss-covered towers of the Crag waited in the grey light. The ascent toward the estate was a journey into a different century. The air grew thinner, smelling of damp earth and the ancient, resinous scent of cedar. Elena walked until her legs ached with the rhythmic strain of the climb, the path narrowing into a trail of cracked slate and aggressive ivy. As she rounded the final bend of the ridge, the forest seemed to peel back, revealing the skeletal remains of the great house. It was not merely a building. It was an architectural gravity that seemed to pull the clouds down to touch its battlements. The crag rose from the limestone cliff like a growth of the earth itself, its walls encrusted with a velvet layer of emerald moss that softened the jagged edges of its ruin. It was massive, far larger than the blurred sketches at the auction had suggested, a fortress of silence that stood guard over the valley she had just left behind. She stood before the rusted iron gates, her breath coming in ragged gasps that mirrored the wind whistling through the empty window frames above. The moss-covered castle felt like a living body, its bones made of granite and its breath the smell of stagnant water and old stone. She reached out to the gates, finding them held fast not by a lock, but by a century of entangled ivy and the sheer weight of their own neglect. She put her shoulder to the metal, the cold iron biting into her palm with the temperature of an ice floe. As she pressed against the barrier, the sound of the hinges shifting was a groan of long-dormant machinery, a protest from a history that had been buried for 100 years. The gates swung inward with a slow, agonizing shriek of metal on metal, a sound that echoed across the valley like a warning. Elena stepped onto the overgrown drive, her feet treading upon a carpet of rotted leaves and slick moss that threatened to upend her. The silence here was different from the silence of the town. It was a heavy, expectant thing, as if the house were holding its breath, watching the small, determined figure in black navigate its decay. She looked up at the great hall's entrance, where the stone lintel was carved with symbols she did not recognize, intertwined vines and geometry that seemed to shift in the failing light. The scale of the place was overwhelming, a testament to a grandeur that had been calculated to intimidate, yet now it stood humbled by time. It was the bones of the thing that interested her, the foundational strength that remained, even as the sills rotted and the glass shattered. She felt a strange, inexplicable kinship with the ruin. Both of them had been discarded by the world, left to be swallowed by the cold. As she reached the massive oak doors of the main entrance, Elena paused, her hand hovering over the iron ring of the knocker. The wood was greyed and pitted, yet it felt solid, a barrier between the cruelty of the valley and whatever secrets lay within the darkness. She pushed the door open, the hinges screaming once more before giving way to a cavernous interior that smelled of wood smoke, parchment, and a profound, ancient dampness. The great hall stretched away into the gloom, its floor a sea of debris and shadow. Above, the remains of a vaulted ceiling held the last of the day's grey light, casting long skeletal fingers across the walls. It was here, in the heart of the decay, that the $3 investment began to feel like something more than a desperate gamble. Elena Vance stood in the center of the hall, the silence wrapping around her like a heavy cloak, and for the first time since the death of her parents, she did not feel like an orphan. She felt like a steward. She began to move through the rooms, her footsteps echoing with a hollow, rhythmic sound. In the parlor, the remains of fine silk curtains hung in tatters, looking like the shed skin of a great serpent. The furniture was gone, likely pillaged decades ago, leaving only the limestone fireplaces and the intricate moldings to tell the story of the Crag's former life. She found the kitchen, where a massive iron range stood like a rusted altar, and a pantry that still held the faint, ghostly scent of dried herbs. Every step revealed a new layer of the house's personality. The way the light hit the dust motes, the specific draft that moved through the back hallway, the distinct chill of the silence in the library. She was learning the language of the house, a vocabulary of stone and shadow that required no flattery and offered no judgment. The sun began to set, the light turning the moss on the exterior walls into a glowing ethereal gold that bled into the dark interior. Elena found a small room off the main hall that seemed less ravaged by the elements, a space where the roof still held and the floorboards did not groan with the threat of collapse. She sat on the cold stone of the hearth, her back against the chimney, and watched the shadows lengthen. She was 19, alone in a moss-covered tomb with nothing but a deed and her own resolve. Yet as the darkness settled over the castle, she felt a peculiar sense of safety. The town of Blackwood was a world of transactional cruelty, but here, amidst the ruins, there was only the labor of the future. She closed her eyes, listening for the water in the distance, not the wheel of the town's industry, and prepared for the first night in a home that the world had forgotten. The night brought a stillness so absolute it felt like a physical weight against her skin. Elena did not sleep immediately. Instead, she occupied the space with her presence, a quiet claim staked in the darkness. She thought of Marcus Finch's mocking laughter and the social coldness of Arthur Sterling's gaze. They saw a ruin, a liability of moss and stone that was worth less than a common laborer's wage. But they had not seen the way the foundation stones were set, nor had they noticed the non-native precision of the carvings that decorated the eaves. They had forgotten that value is not always found in the luster of gold, but in the integrity of the bones. As the wind began to howl through the upper battlements, a lonely and haunting sound, Elena Vance gripped her mother's old wool cloak tighter and waited for the dawn. She had bought the silence of a century for $3, and she intended to listen until the house told her its first secret. Deep in the belly of the house, something shifted, a settling of stone or the sigh of a timber, and the sound resonated through the floorboards like a heartbeat. Elena pressed her palm against the cold limestone of the hearth, feeling the vibration. It was not a sound of collapse, but a sound of endurance. She realized then that the crag was not merely waiting to fall. It was waiting to be seen. The crushing weight of invisibility had been her burden for months. But as she sat in the center of the great ruin, she understood that invisibility could also be a shield. The town believed she was buried here, but she was merely planting herself in the only soil that was truly hers. Tomorrow, the labor would begin. Tomorrow, she would scrape away the moss and find the truth hidden beneath the decay, a truth that she sensed was already beginning to stir in the cold, damp air of the great hall. Tell me, as you listen to the rain against your own windows tonight, have you ever found beauty in a place the world called a ruin? From which corner of the world are you witnessing Elena's first night at the Crag? Share your thoughts below, for the loudest truths are often found in the quietest houses. The dawn did not break over the crag so much as it bled through the mist, a pale and anemic light that failed to warm the frost clinging to the interior stones. Elena Vance awoke not to the chime of a parlor clock or the warmth of a hearth, but to the rhythmic dripping of condensation from a vaulted archway 3 rooms away. Her joints felt as though they had been cast in the same cold iron as the gate she had pushed the night before. A stiffness born of a night spent curled on a limestone floor with only a single wool cloak for a barricade against the damp. While clearing the thick silt and debris from the great hall's hearth that morning, her fingers struck a hard metallic object buried beneath a century of ash. She pulled it free. It was the moss-covered key, a heavy iron instrument that felt cold and unyielding against her palm. She rose slowly, her breath blossoming in a thick white plume that vanished into the shadows of the high ceiling. There was no vanity in this waking. There was only the bone-deep realization that her $3 had purchased a world of labor. The house, like a starving beast, required her strength if it were to yield its secrets. The great hall was her first battlefield. It was a cavern of neglect, where the very air seemed to have solidified into a gray silt of dust and decayed organic matter. Thick, velvet-like carpets of emerald moss climbed the pillars, thriving in the permanent twilight and the trickling moisture of the walls. Elena stood in the center of the debris, a small figure in frayed sarcenet, holding a rusted iron scraper she had found in the scullery and a bucket of water drawn from the stagnant well in the courtyard. The silence of the house was not empty. It was a heavy, watchful thing, the distinct chill of a cathedral before a funeral. She knelt at the base of the nearest pillar, the cold of the stone biting through the fabric of her skirt, and began the grueling task of reclamation. Every stroke of the iron tool against the stone was a heartbeat, a rhythm of survival that she had learned only after the world had turned its back on her. The work was methodical and punishing. With each stroke of the scraper, a layer of the suffocating green was peeled back, revealing the gray-white limestone beneath. The moss came away in damp, heavy clumps that smelled of ancient soil and forgotten rain, a scent that filled her lungs until she felt as though she were inhaling the history of the ruin itself. Her hands, once accustomed to the soft labor of embroidery and the turning of pages, soon rebelled. Blisters rose like small, angry welts across her palms, and the grit of the stone found its way beneath her fingernails. Yet she did not stop. There was a desperate, quiet dignity in the labor. Every inch of stone cleared was a declaration that she was no longer the unseen orphan of Blackwood, but a woman with a foundation beneath her feet. She was not merely cleaning a house. She was excavating her own future from the debris of a discarded past. By the second month of the restoration, the physical toll had transmuted from a sharp, rebellious pain into a dull, constant ache that Elena wore like a second set of garments. The first weeks had been a blur of salt-crusted skin and the stinging scent of lye as she fought back the encroaching rot of the eastern wing. The townspeople of Blackwood, if they thought of her at all, likely imagined her weeping in the dark. But Elena had found a strange sanctuary in the exhaustion. She had cleared the heavy silt from the hearth and scrubbed the soot from the lintels until her knuckles were raw. The calluses on her hands had hardened into a protective shield, mirroring the wall she was building around her heart. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, as the wind began to rattle the loose leaded panes of the high windows, that her scraper caught on something that was not a natural fissure in the rock. Elena paused, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She dipped a rough cloth into the bucket and scrubbed at the area, the lye-heavy water stinging the raw patches on her skin. As the grime dissolved, a series of intricate carvings emerged from the darkness. They were not the crude utilitarian patterns common to the masonry of the valley, nor did they bear any resemblance to the heraldry of the town's founding families. These were non-native geometries, intertwined spirals and sharp mathematical angles that suggested a hand trained in the great ateliers of the continent, far beyond the reach of Blackwood's provincial borders. She traced the lines with a trembling finger, feeling the precision of the chisel marks. They were too refined for a mere border outpost or a merchant's folly. The carvings seemed to pulse with a hidden intent, a silent language of stone that spoke of a grandeur the town had chosen to forget. It occurred to Elena then that the mockery of Marcus Finch and the clinical dismissal of Arthur Sterling were based on a profound ignorance. They saw the moss, but they had never bothered to look at this structural truth beneath. They had treated the crag as a liability because they lacked the patience to see its worth. She leaned her forehead against the damp stone, the coldness a relief against her mounting fever of curiosity. She was clearing away more than just decay. She was unearthing a heritage that did not belong to the men in the valley. The $3 she had paid at the rain-slicked auction now felt like a theft, though it was she who had been robbed of a family. The house was not a ruin. It was a testament to a logic that Arthur Sterling and the council could not fathom. The afternoon light began to shift, turning from a dull grey to a rich, heavy amber as the sun dipped toward the jagged spine of the mountains. Elena moved to the center of the great hall, her body aching with a fatigue that felt like a physical weight, yet she could not bring herself to rest. She began to sweep the floorboards, clearing away a century of rotted rushes and bird droppings that had formed a thick insulating layer over the wood. The broom, a makeshift bundle of twigs tied with twine, scratched against the grain of the oak with a sound like a dry cough. As she pushed the debris toward the threshold, a sudden shaft of light pierced the gloom of the hall, striking the floor at a sharp, unnatural angle. It was the blue hour, the moment when the world between day and night became thin and transparent. The light did not simply fall, it pointed. Elena watched, mesmerized, as the golden beam traveled across the floorboards, illuminating a specific patch of grime that seemed denser than the rest. She dropped to her knees, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that matched the ticking of a ghost clock. She used the hem of her apron to scrub at the spot, ignoring the way the rough wood snagged at the fabric. Beneath the layers of filth, a glint of yellow metal appeared. It was not the dull grey of lead or the rusted orange of iron, but the bright, defiant sheen of brass. She worked with a frantic, focused energy, clearing a circular area until the symbol was fully revealed, a brass inlay, perfectly flush with the wood, depicting a stylized sun with 16 radiating rays. As she cleared more of the floor, she found a second symbol 3 feet to the left, a crescent moon, and then a third, a compass rose. They were positioned with a surveyor's accuracy, embedded in the very spine of the house. Elena realized with a jolt of intellectual clarity that the entire great hall had been designed as a celestial instrument. The brass symbols were markers, intended to align with the sun at specific moments of the year. She looked up at the high, narrow windows, noticing for the first time the way the stonework was angled to funnel the light toward the floor. This was not a castle built for defense. It was a house built for observation, a repository of light and logic in a valley that preferred the darkness of tradition. The sun continued its descent, and as the golden ray touched the very center of the brass sun, a soft mechanical click echoed through the hall. It was a small sound, almost lost in the whistling of the wind through the eaves, but it resonated in the floorboards beneath her knees. Elena froze, her hands pressed flat against the oak. She could feel the vibration of a heavy weight shifting somewhere deep within the walls, a groan of hidden counterweights and ancient gears. The house was breathing again, its lungs filled with the air of her labor. She realized that the symbols were not merely markers. They were keys to an architectural secret that required the solstice sun to unlock. Though it was not yet the solstice, the alignment at the end of the second month was close enough to stir the dormant mechanisms of the estate. The light faded as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the great hall in a heavy violet twilight. Elena sat in the gathering dark, her hands still resting on the brass sun, sensing the precise coldness of the quiet. It was no longer the silence of a grave, but the silence of a library, a space filled with unread words and waiting truths. She thought of her $3, a pittance that had bought her the leash to this sleeping giant. The townspeople would still laugh if they could see her now, a dirt-stained orphan in a ruin, but she knew something they did not. The crag was not a pile of moss and liability. It was a map, and she was the only one who had stayed to read it. Arthur Sterling had tried to bury her here, but he had accidentally given her the keys to the world he thought he owned. As the first stars began to appear through the skeletal roof, Elena rose and made her way back to the small room where she had spent her first night. She moved with a new sense of purpose, her movements no longer dictated by the lethargy of grief, but by the momentum of discovery. She did not have a fire to warm her, nor a candle to light her way. But as she closed the heavy oak door against the night, she felt a profound, settled quiet in her soul. She had spent a lifetime learning the shape of being unseen by the world, but here, in the heart of the ruin, she was beginning to see herself. Tell me, as you listen to the steady pace of Elena's labor tonight, do you believe that value is something we inherit, or something we must dig for with our own hands? From which corner of the world are you watching the first glint of brass emerge from the dust of the crag? Share your thoughts below, for the most enduring foundations are often those we find beneath the moss. The vibration from the mechanical click did not dissipate. It settled into the very marrow of the house, a low-frequency hum that seemed to pulse against the soles of Elena's boots. She remained on her knees for a long time, her fingers still pressed against the brass sun, tracing the cold, precise line where the metal met the oak. The silence that followed was different from the hollow quiet of previous weeks. It was an expectant stillness, as if a clock that had been stopped for a century had finally been wound. Elena rose slowly, her movements cautious, as if any sudden gesture might break the fragile circuit of light and stone she had accidentally completed. She looked from the floor to the wall that separated the great hall from the kitchen passage, noticing a discrepancy in the architectural logic, a thickness of stone and timber that did not account for the narrowness of the corridor beyond. She moved toward the wall, her hand trailing along the damp limestone, feeling for the exact location where the shifting weights had originated. There was a section of paneling rotted and grayed by condensation that felt curiously hollow. Elena reached for her heavy iron scraper and began to pry at the edges of the timber. The wood groaned, a wet and splintering sound that echoed through the cavernous hall like a protest. As she worked, the scent of the house shifted. The pervasive smell of damp moss was suddenly pierced by something sharper, the dry, resinous perfume of ancient cedar and the metallic tang of oxidized lead. This was the scent of preservation, a pocket of air that had remained trapped while the world outside moved on. With a final heave that sent a shudder through her calloused shoulders, the rotted paneling gave way. It did not merely crack, it fell inward, revealing a heavy iron door with a keyhole the shape of a jagged cross. Elena reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold metal of the moss-covered key. As she pressed it into the lock, the tumblers shifted with a sound of long-forgotten precision. The door swung open to reveal a void of absolute darkness. Elena leaned through the opening, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. The air that rushed out to meet her was cold, yet it possessed a clarity that made her lungs ache. She held a candle aloft, watching as the shadows retreated to reveal a room that had no business existing within these derelict confines. It was a scriptorium, perfectly preserved and untouched by the elements that had ransacked the rest of the estate. She stepped through the breach, her feet treading upon polished slate that bore no trace of the moss that plagued the halls. The walls were lined with shelves of dark, heavy oak, each one holding collections of scrolls and leather-bound volumes. In the center of the room stood a massive desk of walnut, its surface cluttered with inkwells of cut glass and quills that had long since dried into skeletal remains. It was a sanctuary of intellect, a hidden engine of record-keeping that stood in silent defiance of the town's collective amnesia. Elena moved toward the desk, her touch light and reverent, as if she were afraid the entire scene might dissolve into dust. Lying across the center of the walnut desk was a map, its edges weighted down by stones of smooth black basalt. Elena leaned over it, her breath catching. It was a map of the valley, rendered with a precision that made the modern municipal charts of Blackwood look like the scribblings of children. It predated the town, the industry, and the rise of Arthur Sterling. On this parchment, the crag was marked not as a ruin, but as the hearthstone, the foundational axis from which all other land grants were measured. The lines of ownership radiated outward from the castle like the rays of the brass sun on the great hall floor, encompassing the very ground where Arthur Sterling's factories now stood, and the municipal buildings where Councilman Graves drafted his condemnations. The map was a revelation of status and legitimacy. Elena traced the flowing script, her fingers trembling as she realized the implications of the geometry. If this document were legal, if it possessed the weight of the crown seal that sat at its corner, then the town of Blackwood was not a sovereign entity, but a tenant. The $3 she had paid for the moss-covered ruin had not bought her a grave. It had bought her the master key to every acre of the valley. She felt the precise weight of a secret that was too large for a single soul to carry. She was no longer just an orphan seeking shelter. She was the custodian of a truth that could dismantle the foundation of the world that had rejected her. She turned her attention to a heavy, iron-bound ledger that sat in a recessed niche behind the desk. It was bound in calfskin, the leather dark and supple despite the passage of time. Elena pulled it toward her, the weight of the volume surprising her, as if the ink within possessed a physical mass of its own. She opened the cover, the vellum pages crackling with a sound like a distant fire. The handwriting was a precise, elegant copperplate, detailing the transactions and annuities of an era that Arthur Sterling's predecessors had tried to erase from the public record. As she began to decode the entries, her mind working with the clinical focus of an accountant, a name began to appear with a haunting frequency: the Blackwood Covenant. The ledger did not merely record debts. It detailed a legal agreement of such profound permanence that it was supposed to be inalienable. According to the entries, the town had been established under a specific set of conditions, a royal mandate that held the Crag steward as the ultimate arbiter of the valley's resources. The document spoke of the perpetuity of the trust and the prohibition of private enclosure. It was evidence of a historical fraud, a meticulous ledger showing how the local power structures had systematically disappeared the original heirs and suppressed the covenant to build an empire on stolen ground. Elena felt the cold weight of the iron-bound book, the core reality finally revealing itself through the ink and parchment. A sound from the great hall shattered her concentration, a rhythmic, metallic tapping that was not the sound of the house settling. It was the sound of a cane against stone. Elena froze, her hand still resting on the page of the ledger, her pulse thumping in her ears. She moved to the breach in the wall, peering out into the twilight. Standing near the brass compass rose was a man whose presence seemed to absorb the shadows. Silas Vane, the town elder and former record-keeper, stood leaning on his heavy walking stick. His face was a map of deep lines, his eyes possessing a keen, searching intelligence that looked through the decay to the girl standing in the shadows of the broken wall. Elena did not speak. She watched him from the darkness, her breath held. Silas did not look toward her immediately. Instead, he looked at the carvings on the lintels and the cleared brass symbols on the floor. He nodded slowly, a gesture of recognition that seemed to bridge a century of silence. He was a man who held the oral history of the valley, a mentor to the ghosts of the Crag, who had waited for someone with the courage to do the labor of restoration. He spoke then, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried no hint of mockery. He said, "I had wondered if anyone would ever find the scriptorium. Most people are too afraid of the moss to look for the truth behind the timber." Elena stepped out from the darkness, the heavy ledger clutched against her chest like a shield. She looked at Silas, her gaze steady, despite the exhaustion that threatened to pull her down. She did not ask how he had entered. She spoke of the work. "The house told me where to look," she murmured, her voice sounding strange after so much silence. It wasn't a secret that was hidden. It was a secret that was simply ignored. She walked toward him, the distance between them feeling like a bridge over a great chasm. She held out the ledger, the iron-bound volume a heavy offering of evidence. They lied about the land, didn't they? Arthur Sterling's family, the council. Every brick in the town is a debt they haven't paid. Silas took the ledger, his hands moving over the calfskin with a familiarity that suggested he had seen it in his dreams. He did not open it immediately. He simply held the weight of it, his expression one of profound, melancholic relief. "They didn't just lie, Miss Vance. They murdered the memory of the law so they could become the law themselves. The Blackwood Covenant was supposed to be burned in the Great Fire of 1792, but it seems the steward of that time had more foresight than the arsonists." He looked up at her, his eyes reflecting the pale light of the rising moon. "You have bought a liability that is worth more than the town. But you must understand that the men in the valley will not let you keep it without a struggle. To them, you are a pauper who found a king's crown in a gutter." The temperature of the silence in the great hall shifted again, growing colder as the reality of the discovery settled between them. Elena looked around the cavernous space, seeing it no longer as a ruin, but as a fortress of accountability. The $3 she had spent was a pittance, but the cost of the truth would be measured in the social coldness of those who stood to lose everything. She thought of Elias Thorne, the stonemason who had watched her from the rain, and Arthur Sterling, who had dismissed her with a transactional coldness. They had seen an invisible orphan, but the scriptorium had given her a name and a legacy that was older than their money. She squared her shoulders, the fatigue of the weeks vanishing beneath a new, iron-willed resolve. She walked back to the breach in the wall and retrieved the map of the valley, the parchment feeling like a living map of her own destiny. She looked at Silas Vane, the elder who had validated her discovery, and felt the first stirrings of a communal bond. She was no longer alone in her restoration. She had a witness to the foundational truth. She would spend the night decoding the rest of the ledger, tracing the lineage of the fraud until she held the legal leash to the local power's throat. The Crag was breathing now, its heart stone pulsing with the momentum of justice, and Elena Vance was the only one with the hands strong enough to hold the wheel. Tell me, as you listen to the echoes of the scriptorium tonight, have you ever found a truth that made the world around you seem like a lie? From which corner of the world are you witnessing Elena's first step into the secret history of Blackwood? Share your thoughts below, for the most enduring legacies are those that refuse to stay buried. The 8th week at the Crag began with a sound that did not belong to the high ridge, the rhythmic, syncopated clatter of iron-rimmed wheels against the slate road. Elena Vance stood on the skeletal balcony of the east wing, her hands stained with the grey dust of mortar and the green residue of a morning spent clearing the guttering. She watched as a polished black gig, drawn by a pair of matched chestnuts that looked entirely too fine for the mud-slick descent, rounded the final bend. Beside the carriage rode a second figure on a sturdy cob, his silhouette unmistakable even through the morning mist. Arthur Sterling did not travel without his shadow, and Reginald Graves was a man whose bureaucratic shadow grew longer as the sun grew colder. Elena felt the moss-covered key heavy in her pocket, a cold weight against her thigh that reminded her of the 3 heavy coins she had surrendered for this very silence. She descended the main staircase, her boots echoing with a hollow, rhythmic thud that sounded like a drumbeat in the cavernous great hall. She did not hurry. To hurry was to acknowledge their authority, and Elena had learned that the most effective defense against the socially powerful was a deliberate, unbothered pace. By the time she reached the massive oak doors, the carriage had come to a halt in the overgrown courtyard. The horses snorted plumes of white steam into the damp air, their harnesses jingling with a sound that felt like an intrusion upon the house's ancient breath. Arthur Sterling stepped onto the gravel, his boots polished to a mirror finish that seemed to repel the very soil of the estate. He looked up at the crumbling battlements with a clinical detachment, as if he were already measuring the stone for a secondary market. Reginald Graves dismounted with the stiff, practiced grace of a man who spent his life navigating the narrow corridors of the law. He held a thick, cream-colored parchment roll in his gloved hand, the red wax of the municipal seal looking like a fresh wound against the paper. Behind them, the forest soughed in the wind, a low and mourning sound that seemed to warn of the coldness to come. Eleanor stepped onto the threshold, the grey sarcenet of her dress fluttering in the draught. She did not descend the steps to meet them. She stood on her own stone, the mistress of a ruin, and waited for the silence to force the first word from their lips. It was the distinct sensation of being viewed as a liability, a state she had occupied since the auction, but one that now possessed a dangerous, hidden edge. Arthur Sterling was the first to speak, his voice a cultivated baritone that lacked the warmth of human concern. He did not offer a greeting. Instead, he addressed the house as if it were a patient in a terminal ward. He noted that the structural integrity of the north-facing gable was a matter of grave concern to the council, and that the recent rains had undoubtedly exacerbated the instability of the foundation. He spoke of municipal codes and public safety with a practiced fluency, his gaze never once meeting Elena's eyes. It was the social coldness of his regard that defined the moment, a refusal to acknowledge her as anything more than a steward of a landscape he intended to reclaim. Reginald Graves stepped forward then, his face a pale oval of professional indifference. He unrolled the parchment with a sharp snapping sound that echoed against the limestone walls. He announced that he was there in his capacity as the council's legal enforcer to serve a formal condemnation notice. The Crag, he claimed, had been deemed a public hazard, a structure whose collapse was not a matter of if but when. He cited Article 14 of the Blackwood Municipal Charter, A clause Elena knew from her parents' old ledgers had been used to seize other properties in the lower valley for the Sterling expansion. The red seal glinted in the grey light, a physical manifestation of a legal leash that was being tightened around her throat. Elena did not reach for the paper. She remained perfectly still, her hands clasped before her calloused fingers hidden by the folds of her skirt. She looked past the men to the chestnut horses, noticing the way their hooves flickered toward the house, sensing a gravity they could not understand. She spoke then, her voice a low, level bell in the morning air. She said that she found it curious that the council had suddenly developed such a keen interest in the safety of a house they had been content to let rot for a century. She mentioned that her $3 had purchased the deed in perpetuity, and that the municipal charter did not supersede the Crown's original land grants. Arthur Sterling's eyes narrowed, a micro-shift in his expression that suggested he had not expected the orphan to possess a tongue for the law. He leaned on his silver-headed cane, the metal clicking against the slate with a sound of finality. He murmured that a girl of 19, alone in a moss-covered tomb, was hardly in a position to debate the finer points of municipal liability. He suggested that if she were to surrender the deed voluntarily, the council might find a way to provide her with a modest annuity, a sum sufficient to see her comfortably settled in a more suitable environment. Far from the cold draughts and the dangerous heights of the ridge, it was a bribe wrapped in the language of charity, a calculated insult to her intelligence. Reginald Graves attempted to press the notice into her hand, but Elena stepped back, her movement as fluid as the shadows in the hall behind her. She did not shout, she did not plead. Instead, she asked Dr. Graves if he had consulted the Hearthstone coordinates before drafting the condemnation, or if the councils had simply forgotten that the town square sat within the Crag's drainage basin. The mention of the Hearthstone caused Graves to stumble, the parchment crinkling in his grip. The term was an architectural ghost, a piece of terminology that had not been used in Blackwood for 3 generations. Sterling's grip on his cane tightened until his knuckles were the color of the limestone. The confrontation ended not with a resolution, but with a retreat. The 2 men returned to the carriage, the gig turning with a violent spray of gravel that felt like a parting threat. The silence that returned after their departure was not the peaceful quiet of the morning, it was the heavy atmosphere of a pending storm. Elena retreated to the scriptorium, the smell of cedar and ancient ink acting as a balm to her frayed nerves. She lit a single candle, the flame dancing in the draught from the breached wall, and pulled the iron-bound ledger toward her. She needed more than the map, she needed the math of the fraud. She spent the next 4 hours immersed in the exacting rhythmic labor of cross-referencing, her eyes tracing the crabbed entries of the 18th century against a set of modern property tax records she had found, tucked into a hidden compartment of the walnut desk. Night had begun to settle over the valley when a soft, hesitant knock echoed from the back entrance of the kitchen. Elena moved through the house with a heavy iron fire poker in one hand and her candle in the other, her heart pounding against her ribs. She found Elias Thorne standing at the threshold, his broad shoulders blocking out the starlight. He was dressed in his heavy work woolens, the scent of stone dust and cold rain clinging to his coat. He did not wait for an invitation. He held out a bundle of papers tied with a surveyor's twine. He said simply that he had heard of the gig's ascent and thought she might have need of the modern records for the Sterling mills. They sat in the scriptorium, the only space in the vast ruin that felt like a sanctuary of logic. Elias watched as Elena laid the modern municipal map over the vellum Hearthstone map, the 2 parchments overlapping like a map of a betrayal. The discrepancy was not a matter of inches but of miles. Elena used a brass ruler to measure the distance from the Great Hall's central sun symbol to the location of the Sterling textile factory in the valley below. According to the original Blackwood covenant, the factory sat directly upon land that had been leased to the Sterling family in 1792 for a term of 99 years, a lease that had expired nearly 3 decades ago. Elias leaned over the desk, his presence a warm, grounded counterweight to the cold secrets of the room. He pointed to the town square, the church, and the council chambers. Every major piece of infrastructure in Blackwood was built on land that technically belonged to the Crag's estate, held under ancient leases that had never been renewed or paid. The Sterlings were not the owners of the valley. They were tenants whose rent had been delinquent for a generation. The financial fraud was as precise as the non-native carvings on the lintels. By suppressing the covenant and the ledger, the founding families had converted a temporary lease into a permanent fraudulent ownership, building their empire on a foundation of stolen time. The secret was worth more than the town because it made the town a liability. If Elena Vance held the legal leash to the Heartstone, then she held the power to evict the very men who sought to condemn her home. She sat back, the weight of the iron-bound ledger feeling like a physical weapon in her lap. The $3 she had paid had bought her a ledger of lost souls and a map of a stolen world. She looked at Elias, her gaze searching for the water, not the wheel, and found in his eyes a quiet reflection of her own resolve. He did not offer words of comfort. He simply adjusted the candle so she could see the next page of the fraud. The labor of the night was just beginning, and for the first time, the orphan of Blackwood realized that she was not just mending a house, she was mending the law. Tell me, as you listen to the rhythmic scratching of the quill against the vellum tonight, have you ever realized that the people who claim to own the world are often just tenants of a history they've forgotten? Where on this earth are you witnessing Elena and Elias uncover the true scope of the Blackwood fraud? Leave a comment below, since the most dangerous secrets are those hidden in plain sight. The rain did not merely fall. It hammered against the battlements of the Crag, with the relentless percussion of an invading army, a deluge so absolute it seemed determined to wash the very memory of the estate from its limestone perch. Within the great hall, the air was the exact temperature of a whetted blade, sharp and smelling of ozone and disturbed earth. Elena Vance stood in the center of the shadows, her morning dress of frayed sarcenet now heavy with the damp, her boots caked in the thick grey mud of the ridge. Beside her, Elias Thorne held a lantern aloft, its flickering amber light catching the grit on his jaw and the quiet intensity of his gaze. They did not speak. The storm outside provided a roar that rendered words insignificant, leaving only the steady, rhythmic labor of their search to define the hour. According to the geometry of the Heartstone map, the physical proof of the Blackwood covenant was not hidden in a shelf or a wall, but was anchored into the very foundation of the house itself. Elena knelt at the base of the central pillar, where the non-native carvings of geometric spirals met the floor. She could feel the vibration of the thunder through the stone, a deep, resonant thrumming that felt like the house's own pulse. With a mason's chisel borrowed from Elias's kit, she began to scrape away the centuries of calcified grout and debris that filled the seam between the pillar and the primary foundation slab. It was a grueling, meticulous task, the competence of the labor acting as her only defense against the mounting dread of the night. The stone was unyielding, a testament to the integrity of the original builders who had set these bones with the intention of perpetuity. Elena's hands ached, the calluses she had earned over the past month burning with the friction of the steel against the rock. Elias knelt beside her, his larger hands providing the leverage needed to pry back a section of the slate that appeared slightly offset from the rest. As the slab groaned and shifted, a pocket of air escaped from beneath, smelling of old iron and the cold mineral scent of a deep well. Beneath the stone lay a cavity lined with charcoal and dry sand, a repository designed to protect its contents from the very dampness that now ravaged the upper floors. In the center of the void sat a box of heavy oxidized lead, its lid sealed with a thick ribbon of wax that bore the unmistakable imprint of a royal signet. Elena reached for it, her fingers trembling as she felt the unexpected mass of the object. It was not merely a box, it was the physical anchor of the valley's history, a secret worth more than the town of Blackwood and the gold of the Sterling family combined. She pulled it from the earth, the leaden weight, a cold reality against her palms. As she brushed away the sand, the lightning outside flared, illuminating the scriptorium's breach and casting long skeletal shadows across the floor. They had found it, the original royal land grant, the document that had been murdered in the minds of the people but had survived in the marrow of the stone. The storm reached its zenith, the wind howling through the empty window frames with a sound like a human scream. Elena and Elias retreated to the warmth of the scriptorium, the only space where the candle could survive the draft. With a steady hand, she used a small knife to break the wax seal, the red shards falling onto the walnut desk like drops of dried blood. Inside, protected by a layer of oiled silk, lay a single sheet of heavy vellum. The ink was as dark and defiant as the day it was dried, the flowing script of the 18th century detailing the true terms of the Blackwood covenant. It was not a deed of private ownership, but a mandate of stewardship, a grant that stipulated the valley was to be held in public trust, its resources governed by the steward of the Crag for the benefit of the community in perpetuity. The revelation was a hammer blow to the logic of the valley. Arthur Sterling and the council had not merely stolen land, they had stolen a future, converting a communal trust into a private monopoly by pretending the covenant did not exist. Elena traced the seal of the crown, the weight of the parchment, feeling heavier than the leaden box. This was the secret that would turn the Sterling factories into liabilities and the town square into a shared legacy. She looked at Elias, the silence between them thick with the implications of the truth. They were no longer just two people in a ruin. They were the holders of a legal leash that could bring the most powerful men in the region to their knees. The sound of the front gates groaning on their hinges signaled the end of their isolation. Through the rain-streaked glass of the east wing, Elena saw the flicker of carriage lamps, two glowing eyes in the darkness of the ridge. Arthur Sterling had not waited for the dawn. He had come while the storm was at its most violent, driven by a desperation that no amount of municipal code could mask. Elena did not hide the box. She did not return the vellum to its leaden shell. She walked into the great hall, the candle in her hand a small, defiant light against the encroaching dark. She stood by the brass sun symbol, the sharp, biting chill of the silence marking the arrival of the enemy. The oak doors swung open, admitting a gust of freezing rain and the tall, imposing figure of the Sterling patriarch. He was alone this time, his heavy greatcoat dripping water onto the floor she had spent weeks scrubbing. He did not look like the clinical aristocrat of the auction block. His hair was disheveled, and his eyes held the sharp, frantic glitter of a man who realized the ground was liquefying beneath his feet. He walked toward her, his cane striking the stone with a rhythmic, aggressive thud. He did not look at the hole in the foundation. His gaze was fixed on the leaden box that sat upon the limestone hearth, its lid open to reveal the glint of the royal seal. Arthur Sterling spoke, his voice low and strained, a sharp contrast to the roar of the thunder. He did not offer a threat. He offered a settlement. He spoke of millions, a sum so vast it could have rebuilt the Crag 10 times over and bought Elena a life of unimaginable silk and sarsenet in any capital of the world. He framed it as an endowment for her future restoration, a gesture of goodwill from a man who claimed to value her resilience. It was the ultimate bribe, a transactional attempt to purchase her silence and the destruction of the vellum. He moved closer, the smell of expensive tobacco and damp wool clashing with the ancient cedar of the house. He asked her to think of the comfort, the safety, the end of the grit beneath her nails. Elena looked at him, her gaze reflecting the social coldness he had once shown her. She did not see a powerful man. She saw a tenant who had forgotten how to pay his rent. She thought of the absolute weight of her former invisibility. The way the town had let her parents' memory fade and had treated her as a ghost because she possessed no gold. She looked at the calluses on her hands, the physical evidence of her labor, and then at the vellum that mandated the valley's freedom. To burn this document would be to burn the structural soul of the estate, to betray the very house that had sheltered her when the world would not. The bribe was an insult because it assumed her worth could be measured in the currency of those who had discarded her. Elena spoke, her voice level and devoid of the melodrama of the storm. She said that she had bought the Crag for $3 and that she found the price of the truth to be far higher than anything he could offer from a bank vault. She mentioned that the covenant was not hers to sell, as it belonged to the water, the trees, and the people who labored in his mills. She told him that he had spent a lifetime building on a lease that had expired, and that the house had finally decided to collect. Sterling's face contorted, the mask of the patriarch slipping to reveal the raw terror of a man facing irrelevance. He reached for the document, his hand trembling with a sudden, violent intent, but Elias Thorne stepped from the shadows of the pillar, his presence an immovable wall of stone and resolve. The silence that followed was absolute, the exact temperature of a final judgment. Arthur Sterling realized then that he could not outbid the orphan, for she had already found a heritage that gold could not tarnish. He retreated into the night, the sound of his carriage wheels fading into the roar of the deluge, leaving Elena alone with the bones of the law. Tell me, as the storm outside your own walls begins to settle tonight, would you choose the comfort of a golden lie or the cold, hard labor of a hidden truth? From which corner of the world are you witnessing Elena hold the leaden box against the darkness? Share your thoughts below, for the most valuable secrets are those that require the strongest hands to hold them. The morning that followed the storm did not bring the usual grey lethargy to the valley of Blackwood. Instead, the air possessed a crystalline sharpness, a clarity that seemed to have scrubbed the sky into a translucent shade of sapphire. Elena Vance stood in the great hall of the Crag, the leaden box resting on the walnut desk of the scriptorium, its weight a physical anchor against the frantic momentum of the night. She had not slept. Her eyes were rimmed with the red fatigue of one who had spent the small hours decoding the marrow of a fraud, yet she felt a peculiar, iron-clad vitality. She moved to the basin and washed the grit of the foundation from her hands, the water cold enough to make her skin ache, a sensation that grounded her in the present reality of her labor. The calluses on her palms were no longer wounds. They were the textured proof of her stewardship. She dressed with a precision that bordered on the clinical. She chose her morning dress of sarsenet, now cleaned of the mud but bearing the faint indelibles of cedar and ancient stone. She pinned her hair back with a silver brooch that had belonged to her mother, the only object of her past life that had not been sacrificed to the auctioneer's hammer. As she looked into the small, cracked mirror in the scullery, she did not see the frightened girl who had stood in the rain with 3 heavy coins. She saw a woman who had mastered the particular geometry of invisibility and had found a way to make it speak. Beside her, Elias Thorne waited in the shadows of the passage, his presence a silent, protective counterweight to the social coldness she was about to face. The town hall of Blackwood was a structure of red brick and bricked white limestone, a monument to the self-importance of the founding families. When Elena Vance approached the building, the leaden box held firmly against her chest, she could feel the vibration of the town's anxiety, a low-frequency hum that mirrored the mechanical click she had heard within the estate walls. Word of Arthur Sterling's midnight retreat had spread through the valley like a mountain mist, chilling the hearts of those who had built their fortunes on the silence of the Hearthstone. The townspeople gathered on the steps, their breath plumes of white in the morning air, watching the Pauper Queen of the Ridge descend from the heights. They no longer laughed. The mockery had been replaced by a heavy, watchful curiosity, the precise shape of a community waiting for its foundation to shift. Elena entered the council chambers as the meeting was being called to order. The room was a sea of dark wool and polished mahogany, smelling of floor wax, stale ink, and the collective nervousness of the municipal elite. At the raised dais sat Reginald Graves, his face the color of damp parchment, his hands trembling as he arranged the condemnation notices that had now become irrelevant. Arthur Sterling was absent, his seat at the front of the gallery a glaring void that spoke more loudly than any testimony. A local news sheet's illustrator sat by the far wall, his charcoal pencil moving with feverish haste, ensuring that the proceedings would be recorded with a public finality that the council could not suppress. Elena did not wait to be summoned. She walked to the center of the floor, the rhythmic thud of her boots against the oak boards, sounding like the heartbeat of the house she had restored. She placed the leaden box on the witness table with a deliberate, metallic sound that cut through the murmurs of the gallery. She did not look at Dr. Graves. She looked at the people of Blackwood, the weavers from the mills, the shopkeepers from the square, and the laborers who had long been told that their world was a gift from the Sterlings. She began to speak, her voice lacking the melodrama of the courtroom, possessing instead the restrained elegance of us presenting a mathematical proof. She spoke of the $3 that had bought a liability, and how that liability had turned out to be a ledger of lost souls. She did not use the word fraud. She used the word discrepancy. She detailed the coordinates of the Hearthstone and the precise geometry of the original land grants, her fingers tracing the lines on the vellum covenant as she laid it over the municipal map. She explained that the Sterling factories, the council chambers, and the very ground they stood upon were held under royal leases that had expired 30 years ago. The secret worth more than the town was not a pile of gold, but the legal reality that the town belonged to the trust, and the trust was mandated to serve the public good. Reginald Graves attempted to interject, his voice a high, frantic reed in the stillness of the hall. He spoke of municipal charters and the legality of modern deeds, but his words were hollow against the weight of the royal seal that glinted on the witness table. Elena did not argue. She simply invited the town's surveyor to verify the non-native carvings on the Crag's lintels against the descriptions in the covenant. She presented the iron-bound ledger, the calfskin pages showing the meticulous history of suppressed payments and stolen time. The social temperature of the room shifted from the coldness of disdain to the warmth of a collective awakening. The secret was out, and it carried the momentum of a century of silence, finally broken. By the time the afternoon sun hit the high windows of the hall, the legal landscape of Blackwood had been upended. The council, faced with the physical evidence of the Crown's mandate, could not sustain the facade of Sterling's ownership. The condemnation notice was not merely rescinded, it was shredded in the minds of the people. Elena Vance did not demand the eviction of the residents or the closure of the mills. Instead, she invoked the stewardship clause of the covenant, dissolving the Sterling Corporation and proposing the transition of the valley's resources into a cooperative trust. The power that had been concentrated in a single carriage was now to be distributed among the hands that did the labor. It was a poetic justice that Arthur Sterling could not outbid, for the currency of the truth was inalienable. The walk back to the Crag was a journey through a world that had been mended. When Elena climbed the ridge, she was no longer a ghost in the trees. She was a woman whose presence had become the cornerstone of the valley. The forest seemed to welcome her, the scent of damp earth and pine needles no longer smelling of isolation, but of a quiet foundational peace. Elias Thorne walked beside her, his silence a shared sanctuary. They did not speak of the victory. They spoke of the work that remained. The mending of the roof, the clearing of the western orchards, and the restoration of the schoolroom for the children of the mill workers. The labor of the house had become the labor of the community. A year passed, marked not by the social calendar of the valley but by the steady, rhythmic progression of the seasons against the stone. The Crag was no longer a ruin swallowed by moss. It was a living body, its windows filled with the warm, amber light of hearth fires and the steady glow of the scriptorium's lamps. The great hall had been cleared of its silt, the floorboards polished until the brass symbols of the sun and moon reflected the sky above. The house had become a sanctuary of logic and craftsmanship, a place where one listened for the water, not the wheel. The town of Blackwood flourished under the cooperative trust, the dignity of manual labor finally recognized as the true wealth of the region. On the anniversary of the auction, Elena Vance stood on the battlements of the east wing, watching the sunset bleed into the blue hour. The valley below was a tapestry of lights, each one a testament to a family that no longer lived in the shadow of a debt. She reached into her pocket and felt the 3 heavy coins she had kept as a reminder of the time she had spent as an invisible figure in the margins. They were warm now, heated by the temperature of her own skin. She looked at the stones beneath her feet, the non-native carvings now sharp and clear in the failing light, and felt the profound quiet of a soul that had found its foundation. She was 20, no longer an orphan of the world, but the steward of a history she had fought to reclaim. Elias Thorne joined her on the ramparts, his hands stained with the dust of a new fireplace he was setting in the library. He did not say anything, he simply stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the same horizon. The silence between them possessed the steady, companionable warmth of a shared future, a quiet, enduring heat that required no explanation. He reached out and placed his hand over hers on the cold granite of the battlement, his calluses catching against her own. It was a gesture of foundational love, a connection built on the shared weight of the stones and the common purpose of the restoration. In that moment, the Crag was not just a castle, it was a home. She had spent much of her young life learning the shape of being overlooked, and a year of her life learning the weight of being witnessed. As the first stars began to appear over the jagged spine of the mountains, Elena Vance closed her eyes and listened to the breath of the valley. The secret, worth more than the town, was finally safe, held in the hands of those who knew the value of the bones. Justice had not come with a gavel, but with the sound of a key turning in a lock that had always been hers by right of labor and law. She was no longer a ghost in a mourning dress. She was the heartstone of the valley, and the house was finally completely at peace. Tell me, as you settle into the quietude of your own sanctuary tonight, have you ever discovered that the thing you thought was a ruin was actually the foundation of your greatest strength? From which corner of the world are you witnessing the final restoration of the Crag and the triumph of the Orphan Queen? Share your thoughts below, for the most enduring legacies are those built by hands that were once invisible.